Hi, my name is Lenya Quinn-Davidson, and I am the Area Fire Advisor for University of California Cooperative Extension in Humboldt County. And this presentation is going to cover prescribed fire liability in California. This is a topic that has great interest, of course, from any private entity who's looking to do prescribed fire projects. It's one of the things that we're all most concerned about, most curious about, and I've spent many years trying to understand and provide guidance on the liability issue, which has been hard because there aren't a lot of examples for us to pull from to help us understand what would happen if something went wrong. So hopefully this presentation will help clarify some of the issues. I do want to acknowledge Sarah Clark, who is a lawyer with Shute Mahali Law Firm in San Francisco, and she's been very instrumental in helping understand some of the nuances of liability law in California. So thanks to her for helping us all work through this. So I want to start out, and if you watched my talk on options and myths, you will have seen kind of a gloss over of this issue, but I wanted to start out with a national perspective of liability law by states. And so across the United States, there are kind of four general categories of liability law. And in my other talk, I just said three, but it's because one of them is some states just don't have a liability law. They have undefined liability. So you see that on this spectrum. On the far end, you have strict liability, which is a situation where if anything goes wrong with a prescribed burn, the person who is responsible for that burn would be liable for any damages in any situation. So it doesn't matter if they were negligent, if they did everything they needed to do, doesn't matter. They're going to be liable in a strict liability state for anything that happens in that prescribed fire setting. Simple negligence is one of the more common liability standards, and you're liable if you're proven negligent. So if you weren't taking the necessary steps to do the burn safely, and you weren't showing diligence in your actions, then you would be liable. So if you were proven negligent. On the far end of the spectrum, we have gross negligence laws, which are similar to simple negligence, except it's a higher standard. So you would have to be proven to have been grossly negligent, as in very careless, acting with complete disregard for safety and for the implications of your actions in order to be held liable. So across the country, we see these different categories. And you'll see that there are quite a few undefined states, and this map I'm showing is from a 2015 paper by Wonka, and a couple states have changed since then, including Colorado, which is now a gross negligence state. But California is a simple negligence state. And so as far as liability law goes, we're actually in a more conducive environment than a lot of other states. And we do have laws that protect us. And if we're showing diligence and we're not being negligent as burners, we do have some protection under California state law. So what does that mean? What is negligence? Now, negligence is defined in state law as a person is not negligent or they acted with due diligence if the person did what might be reasonably expected of a person of ordinary prudence acting under similar circumstances who desired to comply with the law. So basically, you're not negligent if you're doing what a normal person would do under those circumstances to be safe and to be diligent. So it's kind of a wishy-washy definition, but we'll see as we start digging into some of the examples that it's kind of clear what negligence means, and it does make sense. And I think we all can get on board with what negligence really means. And so we see it a lot in our health and safety code. We see these terms, negligence, willfully. So a person who willfully, negligently, or in violation of the law sets fire is going to be liable. So this is personal liability for property damage. We see it again, landowner liability for property damage. So again, in the health and safety code, we see these words. We see without exercising due diligence to control the fire. then you will be liable. So again, this is, you know, this is language that's pointing to that negligence standard that we have in our law. Here's another one. So for fire suppression costs, any person who negligently or in violation of the law sets a fire, allows a fire to be set, or allows a fire to escape onto public or private property is liable for the fire suppression costs. It doesn't say any person who allows a fire to escape is responsible for suppression costs. It says if you were negligently allowing it. So again, this is language in here that does help us understand. We see again in the Public Resources Code that there was some new language that was added through Senate Bill 1260, which passed in 2018. And the new language is bolded there at the bottom. The compliance with the permit issued pursuant to this article shall constitute evidence of due diligence. So this was really helpful. This did not change the law, but this addition that happened in 2018 with the passage of Senate Bill 1260 really helped clarify that the permit that you're given from CAL FIRE that outlines the resources that you need on site, the preparation that's required for your project, that does constitute due diligence if you're following your permit. So that was pretty helpful language that got added there. So let's look at a couple case studies and try to really pick apart what negligence means in practice. This is a case that Sarah Clark brought to my attention. It's an old case from 1957, but it is a negligence case having to do with prescribed fire. So in this case, a landowner did a burn in August, and it was an understory burn. The defendant did have a permit that had been issued by CDF, but there were a number of ways in which they did not comply with their permit, including notification. So they did not notify the neighboring landowner, and they hadn't prepared the unit in the way that was outlined in the permit. So the permit had required that they do some brush work within 60 feet of the road, which was to serve as the project boundary, as the fire line, and they didn't do that. And so they also, in addition to not adhering to their permit fully, they also didn't recognize some of the areas where they were going to have the biggest problems, and they didn't mitigate potential escape in those areas. So there was an area where they were having a lot of fire behavior, a lot of activity, and they didn't have someone even posted there to monitor that part of the burn. That was where they had the escape, and the escape slopped over onto to the neighboring property and caused damages to timber, I think. And in the end, they were found to have been negligent, and they were held responsible for the damages to the neighbor's property. And so in that case, if you read the briefing from the case, they're really pointing back to that negligence standard and saying, hey, these guys didn't even comply with their permit. They didn't even make the necessary notifications, and they hadn't prepped the unit in the way that was required by the permit. In addition to that, they were doing things, like not really recognizing the problem and not having people scouting the unit. And those also pointed to negligence. So they were found negligent in that case. Another case that's really helpful to look at, and is a more current case, it just got resolved in the last year or so, is the Massa case from Monterey County. And this was a chaparral burn that happened in March of 2014. Landowner, couple buddies out helping him do this burn, and I think he burned a lot. This was something that the landowner was pretty comfortable with. He didn't have a lot of people on site to help him. The burn escaped his control and burned onto the neighboring property, and it ended up turning into a wildfire, because there was a wildfire declaration, after the escape happened, and it turned into a wildfire that burned 190 acres in 4 days and required a pretty significant CAL FIRE suppression response to control the fire. So this caught a lot of attention. I remember hearing about it when it happened. CAL FIRE ended up suing the landowner and trying to collect suppression costs, administrative costs, and all the other costs that they had incurred for controlling that wildfire, the Encinal fire. And those costs totaled up to, I think, $527,000. So that's what they were looking to collect from the landowner. So as the case went on, they started looking at what were the things that that the landowner had done that showed that he had been negligent. And they uncovered the brief on this one is really interesting. It's very detailed and goes into a lot of components of what happened that do start pointing to negligence. So again, looking at the burn permit, he did have a permit, which is interesting because it was in March, and I'm not sure in that area, I wouldn't think that he would actually need a permit in March. So I thought it was interesting that he had a CAL FIRE permit in place, but he had not complied with all of the conditions of the permit. So some of the issues that were in direct conflict with the permit, he did not actually burn in the area that had been permitted. So he had a permit in hand, but he ended up burning a different part of his property that wasn't even in the permit. He also constructed control lines on the neighboring property, which was not something that had been outlined in the permit, and maybe he didn't even have permission from the adjacent property. He also had containment lines that were less than a third of the width outlined in the permit. So the permit had mandated that he actually do some black lining within the control lines to buffer the prescribed fire area, and he hadn't done that. So there were at least 3 points where he was in direct conflict with the language in the permit. Additional issues that came up and pointed to negligence were that he had no communication, no radios or cell service among the crew members that he had out there. They also hadn't put in place any kind of ignition plan, so they didn't discuss how they were going to light this unit on fire. They just kind of went out there and started doing it, and a lot of the unit was just ignited from the bottom of the hill with no control line at the top of the hill. They also had a dozer on site, which was the resource that was meeting their permit requirements, but it had known fuel filter issues, and it actually didn't end up working when they needed it. So when the fire escaped control, they went to try to fire up the dozer, and it wasn't working. So they had to spend some time trying to get that up and running, and they lost precious time where they could have been dealing with the fire. They also made a decision not to report the fire when they lost control. So they thought that they might be able to get it under control, and they actually took several hours to notify CAL FIRE and let them know that it had burned onto the adjacent property. At that point, it was getting into the evening, and CAL FIRE wasn't able to really get a handle on it until the next day because it got dark pretty soon. So Massa was found negligent in this case, and he was charged for a portion of the costs associated with the Encinal fire and all the costs that were incurred. Now, one of the interesting things is he was not charged for the full cost, which is what CAL FIRE was seeking. I believe it was closer to half the cost. And what I've heard in conversations with some colleagues in that region is that Public Resource Code 4491 may have been a factor that was considered in this case. Now, PRC 4491 states that CAL FIRE should provide contingency resources for private lands burns if they have resources available. And in this case, Massa had notified CAL FIRE and let them know that he was doing this burn, and they did have resources available, but they didn't send them out. And so if CAL FIRE had provided contingency resources, even one engine, the result likely would have been much different. So that may be part of the reason that Massa was not charged for the full suppression cost, because there was some concept that CAL FIRE should have been there to help out. So let's talk a little bit about ways that we can mitigate these liability concerns when we're burning. One of the big things that we always encourage landowners to do is to include their neighbors in the planning and implementation of projects whenever possible. So if your neighbors are on board, that really changes the dynamic, right? So in both of these examples that we talked about today, the neighbors either hadn't been notified or weren't in support of the project or weren't even on site to be around for it. So we typically try to get neighbors out on burns. They might want to participate. They might want it to be a cross-boundary project where where it spans two different properties, because that's what makes sense from a control standpoint. In this picture on the left, this is a burn that we did in Humboldt County a couple years ago, And we included 2 properties in that burn because on one of the corners of the unit, we needed about 20 acres on the adjacent property to take advantage of the ridgetop as a control feature. And the neighboring property was happy to be involved, and that worked out really well, and it made the burn a safer burn. It's also important to always obtain and comply with relevant permits. If you are showing due diligence, you will have the permits in place, you will have them in hand, and this includes the CAL FIRE permits and the air quality permits. And you'll take an active role in the development of the permit parameters to make sure that they meet your needs, especially in the case of CAL FIRE permits during fire season. That's a negotiation. You can meet with your CAL FIRE folks. You need to look at the permit. You need to look at what they've written, and you can request changes to the language. So one example that we've dealt with here in Humboldt County is we often get permits, the LE8 from CAL FIRE. It's kind of the output of the LE7 permit process, and it'll say, fire, have adequate resources to keep fire within containment lines, or some kind of language like that. We usually request that they give us more specific parameters. We want them to say that we need 25 people and 3 engines, and give us a concept of what they think we would need. Because if it's just that we need adequate resources to keep it within containment lines, if we do have a problem and the burn escapes our control, it kind of puts us in that strict liability category, right? That anything that goes wrong, any reason that the burn goes outside the line would mean that we weren't being diligent. And that's not true. Things can happen. So we really ask for specific parameters and guidance about resources in our permit language. And that helps give us that simple negligence standard where we're doing everything we can based on the expert's advice, based on CAL FIRE's advice. And if something goes wrong, then we know it wasn't because we didn't have enough resources out there. So I really encourage you to work with CAL FIRE to develop your permit parameters and make sure they work for you and make sense. Also ensure that you have planned and prepared your unit adequately for the time of year and the conditions under which you will be burning. There are some basic things that are just always a good idea to have. It's a good idea to have a basic burn plan or prescription that you're working under, to have some kind of control lines or contingency lines. You need to have thought through this stuff. What happens if we lose it? Where are we going to catch it? And have water resources on site. It's just always a good idea. So even if we're doing really low-key, mellow winter burning, we like to have a slip-on unit in the back of the truck in case we need it. And those are the kinds of things that show that you're thinking it through, you're being diligent. Now, another form of liability that a lot of people don't think about, but is very real and probably one of the biggest things that we deal with on burns, is having volunteers or other people working on your property. So if you're a private landowner and you're going to have, community members or other folks who you don't know very well on your burn, then you might want to use release of liability forms. And in the Prescribed Burn Association environment, we do use those. We have everyone sign them at the beginning of each burn and just say that they recognize the risks, and if they sprain an ankle or if they get stung by some bees or if they break a leg or whatever, that they are assuming responsibility for themselves and they understand the risks. And we have a good template for that. So feel free to reach out if that's something you want to see or you want to use. I think it's really helpful. And honestly, probably a bigger concern would be injuries on a burn than actually losing the fire. Now, it's also a great idea to request that CAL FIRE provide contingency resources for your burn, as I talked about with the Massa case. So Public Resource Code 4491 does say that CAL FIRE, if they have resources available, they should send them out to act as contingency on private lands burns. The language is very clear in the Public Resource Code. And so it doesn't mean they have to even be involved in the burn, but they can sit there and just be available if anything goes wrong. And that could be a complete game changer. If something does happen, it's just nice to know that they're there. So don't be afraid to request that. That is a public service that is available to us as private landowners if they have resources available, and often they do. And then always consider the types of additional actions that you should take as a reasonable, prudent prescribed burner. So you should be looking at the weather, you should be making all the required notifications, you should read your permit and then read it again. You know, just think it through. And really it's not as complicated as it sounds to just take the right steps and to not be negligent. And that said, I have burned plenty of times where we could pick holes in the way that I was burning, you know, especially in the winter burns when we don't necessarily have a burn plan and don't necessarily have control lines outside of the aspect and the change in fuel type or something. But we're still thinking about it. We're still taking certain actions to make sure that we're safe. So I think those are really important things to think about. Now, we did put together a little paper on this, just a little 2-pager that kind of summarizes everything I brought up in this presentation. So feel free to email me, or maybe we can email it out as part of the workshop materials. I think it's really helpful just for understanding the different, you know, the national context and then those 2 cases and then that list of ways to mitigate liability. So please feel free to reach out if you would like this 2-page document on prescribed fire liability. And yeah, shoot me an email if you want to talk more about this, if you want to dig into those examples or get copies of those briefs from those cases, just let me know. So thanks so much, and I hope this was useful.